RMC is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your retro gaming with their joysticks featuring genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery. We spend a lot of time in our tea breaks chatting to people who made games back in the 80s and the 90s, but today we're talking to a man who's creating brand new games for an 80s machine. And not just any machine, it's one of the most unique home games machines of all time. It's the Vectrex, and to tell us all about it, hello and welcome, Robin Jubber.
Hi there, and thanks for having me.
Robin, thanks for spending some time with us today. Before we get to your current project, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Are you or were you a games developer at any point, or is this a whole new venture?
I've been making games since probably the mid-90s. I started off on really obscure platforms. So the first game I had published was on the Archimedes, 32-bit Acorns. The first machine I had at home was a BBC Micro. So I'm really good at picking machines that no one else has bought.
Good machines, though. Good machines. I'm looking
great
at,
computers.
Just on the floor across the room, I've got a BBC Master, which I recently acquired and need to clean up. I'm really looking forward to it. They're great machines.
Some fantastic games on them as well. It's where I really got into the hobby. I say hobby, my job. Since the sort of, I think commercial stuff would mostly be the PlayStation era onwards. So I started writing for PS1, 2, 3, 4, and everything else that's been in between. Plus, of course, Xbox and various other consoles.
Okay. So quite a history then in games making. Was BBC Basic where it started for you then?
Yep. Well, mostly. The very, very first machine I ever played with would either be a VAX Delta, because my dad worked at Shell Expo, or which you can't really put in your house, or I think a Sinclair Spectrum, which gave me an introduction to computers. I saw Jetpack and wanted to know how that worked, but it's not a good machine to program on, or it was tough. Those keys are kind of horrible. I didn't know any better at the time, and when I got a BBC Micro, it felt like a huge step forwards. But yeah, BBC Basics my favourite language, probably still after all this time.
So what were those games that you brought out for the Archimedes? What were the names of them?
They were really bad. One of them was Gloop. It was for Fourth Dimension, and they were keen on having a sort of a version of Pipe Mania. So it's basically that.
They were one of the biggest publishers on the platform, weren't they, Fourth Dimension?
Yes, so there weren't a lot of alternatives.
Yeah.
I think Superior Software was still doing a few games for them, and but they were probably the biggest.
Yeah. And then on the PlayStation, can you just rattle through some of the names of the games that you worked on?
Oh, some bad ones. There was. I've had a pretty checkered history of the companies I've worked at. There's a game called Rat Attack, which is on the on the PlayStation and N64. Man, I can't remember half the stuff I've worked on. I worked on Subutio at one point, which is the weirdest game I've ever worked on. That's a simulation of a game.
Did it actually involve flicking the players in the game with a hand?
Yes, because we had the PS1 had those the thumbsticks, which we sort of thought we'd just flick those with your finger. You use it like a football. Yeah. It was about the only good idea involved in that project. And then I worked on a game called Malice on I think it was on PS2 and Xbox, which is a famously troubled history. It took about 4 years to develop. Moved from about 4 different consoles while it was being made, and pretty much started out in the bargain bucket as soon as it was released.
No.
Not every project I've worked on has been quite that bad. Worked on a game called Velocity on PSP and PS3 and PS Vita. That was a really good game. That was really good fun to work on. And things like Coconut Dodge and stuff on PSP. And currently I've been doing a lot of VR projects. So the next thing that I'll have worked on that will be out will be on Oculus Quest. So yeah, quite a big jump between the different kinds of hardware I've worked.
Can you share with us who you're working for currently, or is that on a need-to-know basis?
No, it's. I was most recently working with Endreams, who are based in Farnborough, and they've got a really good VR game coming out. And that means something, because a lot of VR games, including some of the ones I've been contracted to work on, haven't really nailed the format. It's quite hard to make it so you can actually play in VR, and only a few games have really managed to do it, and I think this is going to be one of them.
Excellent. Well, you are right on the cutting edge then of new games making. So what is it that gave you a hankering then to create something for an old system like the Vectrex?
The Vectrix is absolutely mad. There's nothing else like it. It really shouldn't exist, and I don't know why they came up with it in the first place. You can't emulate it. That's one of the best things about it. A graphics card, modern graphics card, can obviously draw lines just as fast as a Vectrex, but it can't make them look the same because you're using vector technology as opposed to raster technology. You can sort of fake it a bit, but it's not quite the same thing. Once you've seen a Vectrex in front of you, you kind of want to program it immediately because it's so bizarre. So like a TV, an old black and white television that's been flipped on its side, it's got a 6809 processor inside it, which is a great 8-bit CPU that nobody else used for anything. I think maybe the Dragon had one.
That's right, yeah, the Dragon 32, yeah.
That's about it. It really wasn't very popular. Maybe the ColecoVision, I'm not entirely certain. So it's kind of a weird chip, but it's a really good chip. It's the forebear of things like the 68000 you get in the Amiga and the Atari, it's a really good CPU. And as an 8-bit chip, it's almost a 16-bit chip. You've got 16-bit instructions, you can do multiplies and things like this, which things like the 6502 can't handle. But the main reason to code for it is once you've seen it, you kind of want to go, how the hell does that even work? Because you don't have bit planes, you don't have bitmaps, you're not using sprites. It's just completely different from everything else. So I sort of thought, maybe I can get a triangle moving around on screen. And before I knew it, I'd written a 64K bank switched cartridge with save games and all sorts of other features. It just expanded.
Yeah. So there was no question in your mind that it had to be the Vectrex. You weren't tossing up between the Commodore 64, Spectrum, or anything like that. You just thought, I've got to make something for the Vectrex.
It wasn't quite like that. It was I just had a baby, and I was going to be spending a bit of time being a dad at home, playing with a newborn child, and coincidentally, I thought I'd muck around with the Vectrex code, see if I could just get something to compile. Just get it to run, because there's not a lot of support for it out there either. It's not like on the C64 you can get tons of different compilers, and there's a lot of information. You have to really dig around on the internet to find out about the Vectrex. But it was kind of addictive. Once I'd made a little thing happen, and then I got Pong running. The most basic game you can write is Pong. Once you do that, that's kind of like the rite of passage. It's like the hello world of games coding. And then I just sort of wanted to add more and more to it. How much I could compress, how much could I fit into a cartridge. And then I found out about bank switching, which the Vectrex can only address about 32K of ROM, which is where you store all of your code and data. But you can trick it. You can send a signal down a certain line that allows it to switch bank. You can also use this to save games, which the original cartridges didn't do. So you can have like a tiny little 32-byte EEPROM and write to that, so you can have a save facility. I just wanted to how much can I fit into 64K of ROM space?
Yeah, and can you use all of that 64K at the same time, or because you're bank switching, it's one or the other half?
It's kind of like you can do it subtly. You can have it, for example, in a menu. My menu system allows. There's about 14 games I wrote into the cartridge. Also, it's like a player 2 tournament. It's kind of like like the Olympics for 2 players, but with lots of old retro games instead of running. So you can have it happen on a menu switch. But if you were making a single game, you could definitely do it. You'd have it somewhere else, like if you were switching levels or something like this.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's very fast.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to your cartridge, which is called Player 2. That's right, isn't it?
That's right.
We'll come on to that shortly. Just sticking to the Vectrex back in its original form, was it a successful machine back in the day?
It was a complete disaster. Their timing was atrocious. The machine came out, I think it was in 1982, just before the one of the many game crashes that happened. And this was a big one. This nearly bankrupted Atari. It nearly took out a lot of games companies at the time. And it certainly did for the Vectrex. You had a fairly expensive console with a fairly small selection of games that didn't look like anything else. So you weren't getting the same titles as on the other machines. And at the time, I think having arcade ports was really important, which the Vectrex had games a bit like some of those machines, but again, it was kind of trailing its own path. You didn't get a straight conversion of anything else because the Vectrex looked so odd and it had vector graphics. So yeah, it died. I don't know how many they sold. Hundreds of thousands, maybe. I doubt it was anywhere like a million for even the worst performing consoles. And now, because they die so fast, you're talking about tens of thousands of machines still left.
Yeah,
maybe.
And one thing that's noticeable in the software library that's available for it is the absence of two-player games, or at least two-player simultaneous games. At least
there isn't anything.
There's just very, very few. Yeah,
it's really strange because it actually has two joystick ports, so it supports it. It can certainly do it. It just nobody thought to do that. I think there's not that many titles. It's maybe 20 games. I'm not sure the exact number. It's something in that region.
Yeah. So is that something that you'd identified as a problem when you set about creating your cartridge? Did you specifically think, right, I need to create two-player games for the Vectrix?
It sort of happened like that, mainly because I was learning 6809 on the fly.
Right.
So when you're learning assembler, your first thought is, how do I get something to work? And then, do I want to write a whole bunch of really complicated AI routines? No, I do not. I am lazy. So maybe I could make some two-player games, and the Vectrex doesn't have any. So it felt like, let's make a whole compendium, so that there's a big gap in the machine's market's the wrong word, in its library could be filled. Also, there was one game I really wanted to write for it, which it felt perfectly at home on the machine, but that didn't exist, and that was Tron. Light cycles. For a vector machine, that's pretty much, you've got to have that on the machine, but it doesn't have it. It turns out it's really hard to write because normally when you're doing drawing pixels to the screen, they stay where they are, and so you can draw even with a very slow machine. You can just continually delete the end of the snake and continually put dots in at the start, and so you can have this long thing getting bigger and bigger. And if you don't delete the end, you can make it as long as you like, no problem. The Vectrex doesn't work like that. Every 50th of a second, you've lost everything. So everything you've written to the screen is gone. So you have to find some way to store all of the places you've been and redraw it every single frame. For two players, bearing in mind that you've only got about 800 bytes of RAM. So it turned out to be much harder than I thought it would be.
Excellent. So Player 2 then, let's talk about Player 2, the cartridge that you've come up with. When did you finish it? When was it released?
I think it was November last year.
Excellent. And just, can you rattle through what games are available on the cartridge? What can we play with?
Blimey. Give me a second. Okay, so there's Pong and tennis. There are variations on the same thing with multiple bats. Then there's Space War. Rotatazor, which is two guys shooting different aliens as they come into a central planet. Spiderfish. I wish I'd thought of a better name for that. You have to shoot spiders or fish. It's basically a reaction game for two players. And then there's balloons, where you have different balloons floating up the screen, and some of them you can shoot and some of them you have to avoid, and the other players trying to do the same, but also trying to shoot you across the gap. So that was sort of like getting the first simple arcade stuff out of the way, once I got a feel for how it worked and how to deal with arrays in the 6809 and how to store graphics data. So I could essentially have, again, sprites isn't really the right word, but it'll do for now. It's sort of a way of storing the data for drawing an actual individual element. And of course, there's no pixels. And then so I started getting a little bit more ambitious, and I made Artillery, which is a bit like Worms, if it was all stuck on one screen. So you have, it's essentially a tank battle. You have multiple different locations, and you've got to try and each take turns to work out the trajectory, fight the wind direction, that kind of stuff, to knock out the other bases. And that started making me get a bit more. Initially it was sort of like a hobby project, and then when I'd written this game, I thought, this is actually half decent. This actually might be quite fun to play for two people. So I wanted to start adding more stuff. So there's a racing game where you have multiple different tracks and two little cars which have inertia and can do handbrake turns around corners and things like this.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a super sprint top-down style racing game.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And that's where I had to learn about fixed point mathematics, so I could do proper inertial movement. Because you've only got 8-bit numbers most of the time, but if you treat them as 16-bit, I don't know if this is incredibly boring to describe.
Not at all.
But you can use the 8-bit number for position, because the Vectrex only has its 256 by 256 is the screen size in essence, although it's not really pixels. But you can use the other half of your 16-bit number as a sort of a fractional part, so you can actually get smooth movement, inertia, and this kind of stuff, which is really important for things like the Space War game as well. Then Tron, which turned out to be the killer. I thought it would be, I'll just knock this together really fast. I mean, I think that one of the first games I wrote on a 286 PC was a version of this for 4 players.
Yeah, I wrote it in Pascal at college just to test myself, test out my programming skills. It wasn't particularly taxing, not in the way that you described for the Vectrex.
Well, I think I wrote mine in Turbo Pascal, so we probably had a similar experience. I almost got kicked out of school for that one. It took over all of the PCs, but it was really easy in Turbo Pascal. It was really hard.
I think the only challenge to figure out was, why does it go quicker down the screen than it goes across the screen, and you compensate
different
for that.
Pixel density, right?
Exactly. That's about it. But nothing like you describe on the Vectrex.
So that was a really interesting challenge to fix, and I don't think I ever want to go back and look at that code because it is horrible. Because you haven't got very much memory. You also tend to end up using routines from other pieces of the code. So the Pong game might grab the score display from the Tron game or something like this, and so that you can jump around in ROM to try and cut down on the amount of usage, and you end up cramming as much as you physically can into it. And then after that, I decided to write incoming, which was a really bad idea. I figured, well, I've got all this space. I've got 8K or 10K or something. Why don't I write a full 100-screen maze game for 2 players with spaceships? That took about the same time as everything else did put together. It was
really well worth it, though, because you let me play this at a recent expo, a little user group meeting that we went to. And you had your 2 Vectrexes set up there. And it was a really fun game. You've got all of the things that you've talked about that you've picked up in the other games, like inertia and gravity and all of these things. There's like a thrust element. If I'm thinking about the same game, there's a thrust element where you have to pick up and sort of grapple with a grappling hook, a thing, and carry it around the level, while player 2's hitting buttons and doing things like that to guide you through the level. From a technical point of view, would you say that was your crowning achievement then in the compilation?
Yes, I had to use everything I'd learned in all of the other games in order to make this one. So it was kind of a combination of everything else. Plus, it's the only co-op game I think that exists on the Vectrex. I don't know of anything else that's like that. Maybe there's another one, but I've not encountered it. So you're not actually trying to ruin each other's lives. You're actually trying to work together. Just a bit of a change. And then I still had a little bit of RAM left after I'd done this. So I wrote. I figured out how to write a version of Joust in 500 bytes. Then I still had a little bit of RAM left even after that, so I put in some screensavers, whole bunch of options, code systems, then systems so you can check the joysticks, check the graphics alignment, all this kind of stuff. Because the Vectrex alignment goes out all the time. The hardware is, it's going on for 40 years old now, and it wasn't great to start with. So the lines don't match up. It goes slowly. The angle slowly rotates to the left. All this kind of stuff happens to Vectrexes. So you have to put in some applications to allow people to test their cartridges out, test the machine. And what else did I put in? There's 3 other hidden games in there. Some seasonal Easter eggs, so that at Christmas, Easter, and Halloween, you can type in codes and you get like an extra free game or some extra free features and stuff like this. So kind of like DLC for the Vectrex.
This is what happens when a game developer doesn't have a deadline to release.
Exactly. If I ever have another child, I'll try writing another game like this. It's probably going to be a while before I get another opportunity like this.
Yeah. So development, you say that the Vectrex can't really be emulated. Was there some form of emulation that you used as part of the development process? Okay.
No, sorry. It certainly can be emulated, but you can't make something that looks like it.
Yeah, you can't emulate the experience of that screen. Yeah.
Yeah. A modern LCD or LED doesn't work in the same way that a vector-driven display does. So you don't get that strange, sharp, crisp glow and all the rest of it. But you can certainly run something that looks a bit like it. So I used... actually, if I could find the name of the emulator. There's one that's sort of half-written, but works very well for this kind of thing. But there's also an actual... Incredibly, there's a development environment now. There's a chap called Malban who's written something called VIDE, or Vectrex integrated development environment. It's kind of like Visual Studio. You've got an emulator built into it, parts of it for dealing with things like graphics and sound. I wish I'd known about this when I started. Because I was doing everything in Notepad and then Visual Studio, and then I started writing some sort of bits and pieces to do this myself, using things like Blender to do the graphics, and like really, really over-engineered solutions for trivial problems. So I could take a very simple piece of artwork in Blender and convert it using a whole Unity project into a bunch of numbers, just so it could run on this machine that like everything on my desk can outperform it. Very, very odd project I ended up doing.
It would have blown the mind of a 1982 Vectrex programmer.
Yeah, they'd have loved to have access to this kind of hardware.
But you must have actual hardware then. Do you have quite a collection of Vectrex machines?
I've got 3, 2 of which work and one of which doesn't turn on anymore. So I think it's probably a power supply problem, probably not damaged internally. But you have to have more than one Vectrex, because once you've bought one, you kind of want another one. And you have a suspicion that the one you've got is going to go wrong fairly soon. So you need a whole bunch of components.
So hoarding spares is the job of any Vectrex owner. And in terms of market, I mean, clearly you weren't designing this to make a profit or anything like that. Because the user base must be so tiny.
If you're going to make an absolutely chronic loss, then write a game for a machine like this. It's the way to go.
Do you have any idea how many are still out there, sort of roughly? Have you seen
how many
figures?
Vectrexes?
Yeah.
No one's really able to work it out. I think there's a system for working out how many of a certain machine exist in real life based on serial numbers. That I think was invented by the MOD to deal with working out how many German tanks existed after the Second World War, because they had a certain number of serial numbers and a certain number of old damaged tanks, but they couldn't work out how many were actually built. So there's a sort of a mathematical formula you can apply. And I think somebody's tried doing it for plugging the same things in the Vectrex, because it was manufactured in America. There's a European version. There's a Japanese version. There's like 2 or 3 different factories were making it. And the serial numbers, they're not serial. They go all over the place. They jump and they have batches. But it's got to be maybe 100,000 of these things ever shipped because they were so unusual, and maybe tens of thousands still exist. Probably most of them don't work anymore. So we're probably talking, maybe 10,000 working machines in the world, and probably less than that.
Yeah, but even fewer owners if you're all hoarding them and gathering parts.
Yeah, I mean, everyone who buys one ends up buying a second one, maybe a third. One guy has about 40 or 50 of them. I've seen the photograph. It's jaw-dropping. Must have cost him a fortune.
So with that in mind then, and with the experience of creating Player 2, will you do it again?
Yes, but I got to get my girlfriend's permission before I do it this time. It became a whole thing. The poor lass has had to go to computer shows and things like that to sell maybe one copy of the game. I think because what happened was I realized I wanted to put it onto a ROM, which meant I had to learn how to burn ROMs, which isn't a skill you really need anymore. So once I did that, then I realized I needed to put it onto a circuit board with an EEPROM and some other components. Once I did that, then I needed to get the cartridges and then stickers for the label at the front of them. And then, because the Vectrix doesn't have color graphics, it has it's monochrome, because I had a job lot of old black and white CRT. So if you want to do color, you have to do a vinyl front cover on the game that goes on the screen. That's transparent. And of course, nobody makes those anymore. So you have to go to a plastics manufacturer and say, "Hi, I've got a really weird order for you," and see what they come up with. That was expensive, because obviously it's a one-off run of a couple of hundred of these things, and they have to build a special piece of kit to allow you to do this run, which they're never going to use for anything else. Then, of course, there's the box printing and the instruction manual, and it just goes on and on. So you realize, what the hell have I done with my time? And you'll probably only sell 100 or 200 copies of the game anyway. But it's kind of fun to have made something that looks like it fits onto the shelf next to everything else.
Yeah, you really have gone to a lot of effort to create a really professional-looking product. It's a really nice package, and you're doing the rounds at expos, trying to. Well, you're not. I wouldn't say you're trying to flog it, because you're not giving the hard sell at all at these expos.
Yes,
you're just having a cup of coffee, chatting with people, and if they happen to buy your game, they buy your game.
That'd be terrific. But I'm not going there expecting, finally I'll make my fortune.
So for those who perhaps do have a Vectrex, all three of you watching now, where can they find your game? Where can they buy your game from?
Well, if they look for Player 2 Vectrex on eBay, I've got some there. Or you can go to jubbernauts.com and you'll find it there as well. Contact details and just drop me an email. Or jubber@jubbernauts.com and I'll sort something out.
Okay, well, I will put all of those links in the description to this video.
That's very kind of you.
I personally have half a Vectrex that was donated to me. I think it was pilfered for parts, and I was given the remains of the corpse. So hopefully,
that's terribly sad.
Hopefully one day I'll have a working Vectrex, and then I'll get to play it here. But until then, thank you for your time, Robin, and good luck with the sales.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks.
Cheers.
If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.